I'm still not audible, am I?
We can hear you now, Sajay.
Different machine, set of problems. Sorry about that. I think this might be a, hold on. Just share the link to the HackMD folks who want to take a look at. So, couple of things. I think the folks who are working on this primarily have a no meeting week, so probably might be short. There are some updates that we can discuss, and if there are, given that we didn't have a specific agenda item, I think we kind of like open the floor to any kind of discussion that people might want to have. So the other thing is I can probably bring up the board. Can folks see the issue board that I'm projecting right now, or is it?
I can see.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, add Kate secret art provider. That sounds good. Yep.
Okay, so shall we just go through these items, or do folks have anything that they want to discuss up front?
Are there any open PRs, Sajay?
I believe there are 4 PRs, right? These ones.
Okay. I think there are PRs for the issues also.
I use.
No? Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, because I have seen somewhere Kate provider, and now I'm seeing the PR with that.
Okay. Okay, so this is probably the biggest one that we wanted to review, right?
Yes.
So I don't know whether anybody had a chance to kind of look at this.
No, I did not have the chance. I'll take a look. Yeah, I'll provide some feedback.
I can talk about it a little bit if that probably will make it easier.
Yeah, that would be great.
So yeah, I think a couple of weeks ago, we had kind of discussed the intention to add a Kubernetes secret auth provider. So I went ahead and created this simple design spec and then a first version of it. So basically, the Kubernetes auth provider, all it's going to do is it's going to read the Kubernetes secrets currently in the cluster that Ratify is deployed in, and it supports 3 different types of secrets. It supports a basic auth secret, a new Docker config JSON secret, or the legacy .docker config secret. And it can basically, once it reads in the secrets from the cluster, it can determine what type the secret is and then extract the registry credentials according to each secret type. So if it's just basic auth, then it just takes the username and password, populates the auth config, and then returns that. If it's the legacy or the new config.json secret, then it deserializes it like a regular Docker config file would be done, and then it extracts the corresponding auth config for that specific registry host and returns that. So that at a high level, that's all it does.
How does it access the API server for the secrets? What's the permission model?
So it uses the core v1 REST API, and it has to have the one caveat is that it has to have a role that's defined, and then it has to have a role binding that's defined to actually get access to the secrets in the cluster. That was the only way that I kind of figured out on how to actually read the secrets, for Ratify to actually be able to read the secrets, but not super familiar with how all of the permissions work in the cluster. So if there's like another way to do that, then more than happy to switch over to that. But currently what I do is that I just define a read secret role, and then I define a role binding that binds the user or service account for the Ratify pod to that role, and then it works.
So the only way to scope Ratify not to get every secret on the cluster is the namespace? How do we restrict Ratify not to access every secret on the cluster?
Yeah, so it's namespace, as far as I can tell, it's namespace scoped. So for each namespace that you want to give Ratify access to, then you specify that. But I'm not going to say that's the only way, because I'm not completely familiar with it, but this was kind of the way that I had seen it done. So.
Or is it the Ratify namespace, only secrets within the Ratify?
Yeah, we could definitely, it just depends on the role binding that you define. So you could just specify so that it only binds secrets stored in the Ratify namespace. So.
So currently this is in draft mode, right? Do you want to change this to an actual PR, or do you want to keep it in draft?
I can change it to a PR. I just wasn't sure if kind of wanted like a design doc review before finalizing, but I can actually change it, because the PR as it is right now, it does work based off of the design doc spec. So.
Do you want to also include the spec, the write-up as a part of this into the docs folder?
Sure, yeah, I can do that.
Did you get a chance to take a look at how this Kubernetes secrets is used in Google Container Registry? I remember
Yes.
there is something called K chain or something like that.
So I did take a look at it, and at its core, they do it the same way, but they rely upon image pull secrets primarily. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but the way they extract the secrets is the same. They use the same API. I mean
the permissions, right? That's where we are.
Yeah, the permissions.
It's the same model, the service account and get secrets.
I'm not completely sure for that. I can look into it. Yep, I'll look into it.
So I had a question with regards to the implementation. If we had a cluster role, could we not bind with multiple namespace bindings, role bindings? That way the cluster role itself would give us a uniform access to these secrets in individual namespaces, and then the role binding that's namespace scoped would scope that access to that specific namespace that was onboarded to Ratify. Just thinking out loud. I mean, that's generally when we do multi-tenancy and we bring people on board for namespaces with, they have their own namespace. We generally do that with a cluster role that gives them the same access to their namespace that any other namespace admin would get. But then we use a role binding to that cluster role, which then scopes that access down to their specific namespace. So that's when you were asking earlier about how do we control how the Ratify is accessing secrets in different namespaces. I was wondering about that.
Yeah, I think we could definitely do that. If that's kind of how it currently is, the topology is, then we can switch over to using that. So
No, I'm not saying that that's how when you say topology, I'm not sure what topology you're talking about. All I'm saying is when you do multi-tenancy, that's one of the ways that you ensure uniformity of access with having scope of access down to the namespace. So using a cluster role and a namespace role binding. But I mean, I'm just throwing it out there. It's just an idea.
Jimmy, just for my understanding, Ratify will be there in the cluster, but it should be able to ratify images, right? It should be able to reach out multiple ACRs, although Ratify is its own namespace. And the secrets for each of these container registries may be in different namespaces. So your idea is we create a role and we bind all the namespaces that have those secrets to that role, and you assign that role to the Ratify. That's how it accesses it.
So what I'm saying is, some of the options that I see on the table are Ratify gets a cluster role and a cluster role binding that gives it access to whatever namespaces it needs proactively. The other way would be move secrets into Ratify that give access to the namespace objects that we need, right?
Yep.
And then the third way, I think, is to create a cluster role that Ratify will need, that provides permissions for each that Ratify will need in the namespace where the secrets reside. And then instead of using a cluster role binding, use a role binding that would give it namespace specific access. That's the only reason I brought it up.
Got it. I see. So Ratify can have multiple cluster role bindings to the individual namespaces, or a single role with multiple namespaces bound to it, or you have all the secrets in the namespace of the Ratify.
So what I was thinking, just to make sure you're clear on what I was thinking, it would, if we wanted to do it with a role binding per namespace, then it would be a cluster role for Ratify, and then a namespace scoped role binding to that cluster role.
I see.
Right. So you'd get uniformity of the cluster role across the cluster. And so each time Ratify went into a namespace, it would have the same permissions into that namespace that it had in a different namespace. However, the role binding would actually give Ratify the access into that namespace, scoped just for that namespace.
Yeah, I'll do my homework to read about the cluster role and role bindings, which I'm not doing.
I mean, you see it sometimes with administrators of namespaces. You also see it a lot of times with let's see, you see it with service accounts as well, where you want to give service accounts the exact same permissions across, the cluster, but you want to scope it to the individual namespace in which the service account exists, then you would create a cluster role, and then you would use a role binding so that, you get uniform permissions, but you get namespace scoped permissions as well.
So I think, Rakesh, from my side, I'll read about the RBAC of Kubernetes, and then I can read the spec.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I'm also not super familiar with
Exactly.
this. This was just the first route I tried and it worked. So, but I think, yeah, we need to discuss and figure out what the best. Is, so
Yeah.
Jimmy, I had a question for you. Is there any common pattern that you recommend that we go with at this point in time? Even though there are multiple options, what do you think would be a reasonable recommendation that we could kind of start with as, okay, this is what we wanted to approach it with, just so that we do see more people actually deploy in a multi-tenant environment. So it would be good to say that for this direction would be a good path. Is there something that we could read upon, or anything that you guys would like to kind of refer us to?
Well, I mean, the only thing that I guess the patterns that I would be used to would be, patterns of how like Open Gatekeeper or Caverno or other policy management tools actually will onboard namespaces. So, but what they're doing is differently scoped than what you're looking to do. So, I mean, you're looking to actually get at secrets that you need, that Ratify needs to actually execute. Whereas these tools are actually looking at, when do I onboard a namespace or include it in a set of policies that I want to run, that type of thing. So, I mean, it's there's several different patterns out there. The using cluster roles with namespace role bindings is one pattern. And then using actual namespaces inside policies is a different pattern, or using namespace, using labels to select namespaces that are going to onboard to Ratify. So, I mean, I look at how intrusive this is going to be. If I say, I want you, if we say that when you onboard your namespace, we want you to create this role binding, and part of installing Ratify into the cluster, would be creating the cluster role itself. So when you create the role binding, you've now effectively given Ratify access to your namespace expressly to use whatever secret Ratify needs to use. If you're using an image pool secret or whatever you're using, Ratify will have access to it via that role binding. And then you could revoke that permission by removing that role binding from the namespace. So there may be a better way. I'm just throwing that one out there as one of the patterns I've seen the most.
So basically, a role binding is nothing but something like a role assignment that enables Ratify to use a specific secret in a namespace, right?
Yeah, the role binding itself doesn't have any permissions in it.
Okay. So
the cluster role would have the actual permissions.
Okay. So one thing that I could do is there is a mutating controller and gatekeeper that needs to do some tag to digest resolution that requires a very similar concept of accessing one registry or multiple registries. So let me also follow up with the gatekeeper folks if they have a recommendation on how they would do a mutating controller across in a multi-tenant form. What's the recommendation?
A mutating controller? I mean, so yeah, with the mutating, I've got some example code here I was just working on for something else. So let's say I have, first off, if I was using Open Gatekeeper and I was going to do mutations, the assignment mutations seems like something that I would use for this particular, access. I don't know for sure. There's 3 different mutations. There's assignment, modify set, and then there's one more. Our metadata assignment is the third one. So essentially, when you write your policy for mutation, you actually tell it match these namespaces. So another way would be if I've got a policy that I want to use with Ratify and it's a mutation policy, then there's an array inside the match namespaces element where I would include my namespaces. So that would be a way of including that namespace to be at least watched by that policy for possible mutation. That doesn't address permissions at all. All it does is say, include my namespace now when you look at inbound requests that need to be mutated. So it comes down to, and that would be more of an obfuscation than I think would be a permissions or security. So,
right. So there is a tag to digest mutating controller that we were thinking about. For that to actually execute, it would have to reach out to the registry to resolve the tag and convert it to some digest. So without permissions, that would not work, especially for a anonymous scenario.
So yeah. So and then I wonder, we need to talk more, I think, about. I think most of the time, well, maybe my experience, I'm used to cluster-wide permissions to actually go to hit an ECR or hit a Azure repository or something else, or even Quay. So hitting a registry, I look at it as a cluster-wide thing. However, if we need to support namespace specific permissions to specific registries, then we're back to a namespace level permission, I think. So, I mean, if your pool secrets are going to be scoped, and then they can be, I guess, scoped down to the namespace because it's a secret itself, then yeah, you're back to permissions. Because the mutation itself that's only going to include the namespace in the mutation. It's not going to give Ratify the rights to get into that namespace unless you've given it some other way to do that, like you've given it a cluster role and a cluster role binding. If you've done it that way, then it's got access to every namespace if you use the cluster role binding. So, I mean, the trade-offs are essentially, I get more security if I use a namespace scoped role binding, but then that trade-off is that I have to, operate that. I have to administer that, and that becomes, let's say, part of the onboarding to, this project or this solution.
Right. So given that we don't have a clear definition at this point, let's follow up with the gatekeeper folks. I think Sata should definitely help us kind of like define what would be a path, and we can write something up that would enable both like a simple get started scenario, which is going to be maybe cluster wide, but definitely have some recommendation for
yeah, we can do that.
Perfect. Sounds good. Cool. So I think the one item that we wanted to kind of like just Nathan could not make it to the call, but he did start kind of putting this repository together, which is the GitHub action that's getting published. So this repository just became public, and we're gonna slowly start trying to use this and see how, and kind of like keep polishing it to get what do you say, an ability to do something like a signature validation as a part of an action going forward. So that's another effort that's been going on. Folks can take a look. I think the Hack Talk has a link to this one as well. What next? Eric mentioned that he'll try to take a look at the recording today, because he has a lot of context on this and on the case side as well. So we should probably get some good definition of how the multi-tenant scenario should work. Okay, Teja, do you have any concerns on this PR?
Which this one? I think I had a comment.
Right.
There is already a home directory package that has all this home directory parsing. I was just curious if that can be reused rather than building it again, like if it is Windows or Linux or something like that. It already has those things over there. There were some comments.
Okay, let's come back to this then next week. Or I'll follow up with Eric as well. This is good to Mark at this point.
So actually, I've been waiting for a review from Eric and Teja, if you have some time as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Oh. Right. So one issue that I want to bring up, it's something that we've spoken about, which is to support multiple secrets. Right now, we have Ratify takes an array of secrets, and that still needs to be. We need to decide how we can actually pick up maybe a full directory of certs, depending on how the certs are mounted. I don't think there is an issue, but we haven't kind of like made any progress with it. So we need to probably like look at that one issue. And Susan is not there this week, so I'll talk to Susan and Eric and kind of follow up on how to prioritize that as well. Besides that, I did not have anything else. Was there any other items that folks want to discuss on, or are we good?
I don't have any.
It's been a slow week, so I don't expect much.
Next week I'll be for suggest, so can record, I'll watch.
Cool.
Yeah, nothing from my side.
Sounds good. So then maybe we can wrap it up. Jimmy, I really appreciate your input on this, by the way.
Thanks,
Oh,
Jimmy.
yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
Just trying to get, become part of this, get started somewhat.
Thank you. Thanks so much. All right. Thank you, folks. I'll post the notes and follow up with them as well. Thank you, everyone.
All right. See you.
Thanks.